Welcome to Solo, the world's most dangerous dog podcast. Join Solo and his long-suffering family in various misadventures about the trouble the best dog in the world can cause. Read by J.R.R. Langley, adapted from the Adventures of Solo books. In this episode, Solo and the Election, Solo decides voting looks like fun.
Solo's family were all agog. The entire country was in the grip of a national election. Which party would win and who would become leader of the country? Dad could be found pontificating every day over breakfast, complaining to anyone who would listen that the current government was a complete shambles and deserves to be thrown out on their ear. The race was too close to call right up until the day of the election, with the press either supporting one side or the other. The children in the household were too young to vote, but even they were caught up with election fever as the television stations ran nothing but election coverage seemingly all the time. Only Mum and Solo seemed immune to the deluge of election coverage. Mum because she felt each side was as bad as the other, and Solo because, well, he simply didn't care. After all, he was not allowed to vote, so why should the election be of any interest to him whatsoever? When dogs were allowed to vote, then he would perhaps pay attention. Solo did try to follow what was being said at the kitchen table each morning from his usual perch near the wood-burning stove, but not too close so he didn't overheat. From what Solo could make out, the current Prime Minister had decided to call an election that caught everybody by surprise. It also caught the entire country by surprise when some of the worst weather in a long time poured down buckets and buckets of rain. This made the election process a very wet one indeed. It also meant that come election day, most voters were going to the polls in the rain. Dad had decided to take the late train to work on the day of the election, so he and Mum could go and vote. Their polling station was in the next village over, which meant they would have to drive through the pouring rain. The foul weather and the thought of the current Prime Minister being re-elected put Dad in a foul mood. For the first time ever, the children were glad when they had to go to school. "What shall we do with Solo?" said Mum after the children had gone to catch their bus and she and Dad prepared to go and vote. "Leave him here? Although he might enjoy the ride, wouldn't you, boy?" She spoke directly to Solo, who at that moment decided to do an almighty stretch on the kitchen floor. Laying on his side, Solo's stretches were a sight to behold. First he would rub the side of his head on the floor, then he would stretch out his front legs, then his hind legs, before bringing the whole exercise together in one long stretch. Dad simply made a grunting sound under his breath as he observed Solo's elongated stretch. Solo wagged his tail in acknowledgement that Dad was looking at him. His tail made a loud thud-thud on the tiled floor. As Solo's belly was warmed by the wood-burning stove, Solo pondered the idea of going for a ride. It had not gone unnoticed to him that the rain seemed to be pouring harder against the windows. Going for a ride would mean giving up his cozy spot in the kitchen, all for the sake of heading out into the cold, damp day. Solo decided that staying in the warm kitchen seemed like a very good idea indeed. Let Mum and Dad go into the wind and rain if they wanted to, but Solo was staying put. "He hasn't moved," said Mum. "I suppose he doesn't want to go." Dad simply grunted again and put on his coat. "He can stay. It will be better without him anyway," he told his wife. "Besides, remember Bert's coming to unclog the sink. Solo can keep him company." Solo sat up slightly. Bert was the family's long-time plumber, who they trusted enough to let himself into the house even when they weren't there. Solo liked Bert. In fact, Solo liked most of the tradesmen that the family used. Solo decided he was quite looking forward to Bert coming. "I bet I can help unclog that sink," he thought. As Mum and Dad got ready to head out, Solo suddenly remembered something. The last time Solo had dealings with Bert was when the toilet in the hallway had overflowed and Solo had caught some of the blame. He quickly decided that perhaps it might be a good idea to go with Mum and Dad after all. The last thing Solo wanted was to be around when there was another flood in the house. Besides, he did enjoy going for rides. It was always fun to watch people and to wonder what on earth it was that humans found to do at all hours of the day and night, even in the rain. Solo ran into the hallway just as Mum and Dad had opened the front door. Without stopping for a second, he ran to the rear of the family's SUV and waited in the rain, a big smile on his face, wagging his tail ferociously. "I suppose Solo's changed his mind," said Mum. "Go on, boy," as she opened up the rear hatch and Solo jumped right in. Dad simply grunted a third time. The rain dripping down his neck wasn't helping improve his mood. Neither was the prospect of the current government being re-elected. As they drove down the narrow country lanes out of their village and into the countryside, Solo sat up and looked around from his vantage point in the back. Solo loved going for rides. He liked the sway of the car, the sights he would see, and the new smells. Today, though, no one was walking anywhere. The rain was simply too bad, although Solo did see the young vicar on his bike, wrapped up in yellow waterproofs trying to get somewhere, looking utterly miserable as he endeavoured to avoid the worst of the puddles. Solo liked the vicar, and he liked to think that the vicar liked him, despite the fact he had once taken the vicar for a ride on the front of the family car and depositing him into a muddy pond. As they drove by, the vicar looked up, recognizing the family's silver SUV. He noticed Solo in the back, looking directly at him. Remembering his previous run-ins with Solo in vivid detail, the ride on the front of the car, Solo getting tangled up in the bell pulls at the church, the vicar said a quick prayer under his breath and pulled on the brakes of his bike in order to give Solo's car plenty of room. He wasn't going to take any chances with that dog, he thought. The vicar always thought Solo was a danger to humanity and vowed to avoid him at all costs. Unfortunately, due to the heavy rain, the bike's tires started to skid. Panicking slightly, the vicar tried to steer the bike to safety and away from the hedges that lined the side of the lane. In doing so, he steered too hard and too fast, causing the front wheel of the bike to hit a deep puddle, slowing the bike dramatically. The bike came to a complete stop in the large puddle, and ever so slowly the bike and the vicar toppled over, throwing the vicar onto the muddy verge of the lane. He sat up, rain now pouring down his neck, somewhat pleased with himself that his yellow waterproofs had protected him from the worst of the water. But just then a white delivery van sped by, its wheels hitting the puddle with full force, throwing gallons of muddy water directly onto the vicar and into his face. The van sped on, blissfully unaware of the soaking wet vicar in its wake. The vicar looked up, his face now stained with mud and water. He was just in time to see Solo's car disappearing over a hill in the distance. He could still make out Solo looking directly at him with a rather perplexed look on his face. The vicar, shaking water from his person, stood up, grabbed his bike, and set off, determined more than ever he was going to avoid Solo at all costs. As they sped away, Solo wondered, not for the first time, how it was that the vicar was always getting himself into trouble. He seemed like such a sensible person, too, for a human. As Mum, Dad and Solo continued on their merry way, the weather became even worse, so much so that by the time they came to the next town and the polling station, which was inside the local church, the streets were starting to fill with water. "Come on," said Dad to his wife, "let's get this over with. Solo, we'll be right back." He spoke to Solo in the back of the car, and with that, Mum and Dad ran as fast as they could through the rain and into the church. Solo watched them go, wondering not for the first time why it was humans didn't like being in the rain. Solo loved running around in the rain, splashing through puddles, and then when his fur was drenched, shaking as hard as he could to get rid of the water, preferably next to a human. Their reactions were priceless. The other thing Solo wondered was why Mum and Dad were running into the little church in the first place. Solo had some experiences with churches recently, but had never seen Mum and Dad so keen to run into one. He pondered this situation for a moment. Then, as often happens with Solo, curiosity got the better of him. Solo is a very observant dog, and he had noticed several things when Mum and Dad left in such a hurry. First, Dad had failed to lock the car. Secondly, Mum, in a hurry to avoid getting too wet, had failed to latch her door correctly. Solo squeezed himself out from the cargo area into the passenger seats and then onto the front seats. From there he pushed against Mum's door, and sure enough, it swung open. Looking around to make sure Mum and Dad weren't on their way back, Solo ran across the small car park and into the church hall. No one saw him. The room was virtually empty. Many voters had decided to stay home, hoping that the rain would ease up a bit. Solo noticed Mum and Dad, each heads down in a separate little cubicle, looking at some kind of screen. They were so focused on their activities they didn't pay attention to him. Neither did the two volunteers who were running the polling station. The complete lack of voters meant both volunteers decided it was time for a cup of tea, so they had gone to the small kitchen in the back of the hall to brew up the kettle. This meant Solo was free to wander. Each voting booth was about 6 feet tall, with signs to protect whatever the voter was doing from prying eyes. He looked up at a terminal which voters were to use to cast their ballots. Solo couldn't see what was on the screen as he wasn't tall enough, but he could make out the glow coming from the screen. Determined to see what Mum and Dad were so diligently staring at, he jumped up, resting his front paws on the screen. He stared at all the pretty lights, quite fascinated by what he was looking at. Next to the screen were a series of buttons, but it was the large red one that caught his attention the most. Solo sniffed at it, and then quite accidentally pushed it with his nose. The machine made a slight click, then a beep. The screen then changed from white to a blue color. The machine beeped one more time and fell silent. Solo stared at it for a few moments more, but nothing else happened. Bored, he let his front legs fall back to the ground. Still not understanding why Mum and Dad were staring at their screens, after all, nothing much had happened when Solo had done the same, he made his way back outside and jumped into the still open front door of the family SUV. He decided he much preferred being on the front passenger seat, so he rested there on his haunches, looking at the rain, but not before giving one almighty shake to remove as much water as possible, showering the inside of the car with water and not a little amount of damp dog hair. This was how Mum and Dad found Solo a few minutes later, sitting comfortably in the front passenger seat, water dripping slowly from the ceiling, mingled with the odd fluffy ball of dog hair. The front seat was so wet from where Solo had been sitting that Mum had to ride in the back seat for the journey home. Mum and Dad never did figure out how the front door of the car was opened, nor how it was that Solo got so wet. Needless to say, Dad vowed to purchase a dog guard for the back of the SUV designed to prevent Solo from jumping out of the cargo area and into the passenger area. For the short drive home, Solo laid down on the blanket in the back of the car and allowed the motion to rock him gently to sleep. That evening, Dad stayed up late to watch the election results roll in. Solo decided to keep him company in the living room, lying on the floor in front of Dad, one eye open on the television, the other half closed as he struggled to stay awake. Solo still couldn't understand what it was that Dad found so compelling about election. It all seemed extremely boring to him. Just then, Dad called out to his wife to come in and watch with him, as it seemed the reporters on the television were about to call the election results for the area that Solo's family lived. As Mum sat down next to Dad, Solo decided to pay attention. If his family was paying attention to this, then clearly Solo needed to pay attention as well. The man on the television read out the results. Suddenly, there was a gasp in the audience on the television, and Mum and Dad gasped too. It seemed that the person Dad had wanted to win the election in their area had lost by a single vote. "One vote! One vote!" said Dad loudly to the television. "Our man lost by one vote? When does that ever happen? Never!" He yelled again as he answered his own question. "I would love to know who that one voter was," Dad continued. "He needs to be run out of town." Dad sat back in the chair with a big thud, thoroughly upset by the election result. Solo watched Dad's outburst from the floor just in front of the television. If Dad was upset, then he was upset too. Who was this person that had allowed Dad's man to lose by a single vote? Solo decided he would like to know as well.
You were listening to Solo and the Election, written by J.R.R. Langley and read by the author. Solo and the Election can be found in Solo Book 2, with illustrations by Stephanie Schultz, edited by Catherine Perkins, published by Heavy Media. Find this story and more in the Books of Solo's Adventures at Amazon.com and at solothedog.com. Ask for Solo at your favorite bookstore.